Let's go back now to one of our top stories. The ANC has now made its resolutions. Then what? Among some of the resolutions is the admission that the energy crisis is undermining growth and investment and must be dealt with speedily. Households are going through tough times and the party says this is undermining democracy. There's also talk of government stepping up law enforcement and intelligence to deal with the destruction and looting of public infrastructure. Let's now discuss this further with our economics editor, Tshepo Mongoai, who joins us in studio. Tshepo, thank you so much for your time. If one has been following, the ANC conferences and the resolutions and gets to this particular moment, will wonder, are these going to fall by the wayside? Are these going to be implemented? What's next?
Well, history tells us some of these things do fall by the wayside, obviously. And also, those that appeal tend to eventually make it through to lawmakers. Obviously, from now on, we do expect that government departments will start looking at this very closely to see how they can incorporate that in terms of perhaps their work. Some may need some changes in terms of legislation or amendments. And of course, it's a long process. We are told that it could take about 5 years, but we know that in the past there were certain resolutions that did not see the light of the day. With time, of course, things change very fast. There are certain priorities that get overtaken. So with each new 5 years, 3 years, there will always be key priorities given that particular time. So they are likely to change. But is going to take some time for us to see some of these implemented. Perhaps they may not even be implemented as resolved by the ANC. There may be certain other interests that may be taken into consideration. There may be certain lobby groups who would make sure that their voices are heard and may have an influence in terms of those resolutions. It's not given that things will happen as expected. South Africa has got a lot of interest and different interests that we need to take into consideration. So it's going to be an interesting one going forward, and whether the ANC is going to use some of this resolution as part of the electioneering, it will be quite interesting.
And definitely it's going to be interesting, especially when one thinks about in the past when we would hear state banks and all of that, the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, and that actually drew the ire of so many people. But let's look at this interesting one that has also emerged, moving Transnet to transport, moving Eskom to energy. A lot of people have questioned this and saying that, do these particular departments, though, have the capacity to handle this should it happen?
Yeah, you may see some departments becoming overwhelmed. I think it's something that needs to be managed properly, given the history and the complexity of these state-owned enterprises and some of the challenges that they are facing at the moment. So, for example, the Department of Transport, you have a lot of huge state-owned entities that have a lot of influence in terms of the economic activity, like you have your Transnet, as you pointed out, which has a very important role to play. Now, taking it to the Department of Transport, of course, you need to capacitate such departments to ensure that indeed they are able to cope with the complexity of Transnet and the fact that if anything goes wrong, as it may appear that things are going wrong, it has a huge bearing on economic activities. There are, for example, Denel going back to defense, and we know that within defense they also face serious constraints, especially in terms of funding, and we know the problems that Denel comes with. But it's about exactly what government is trying to achieve. If the vision is very clear, it helps in terms of paving the way forward to make sure that we restore those state state-owned enterprises. But say, for example, SAA, government still has a major share. So now you're also taking that within the fold of the Department of Transport. It may appear that perhaps the Department of Transport might be overwhelmed by such alignment, as maybe the vision and the idea is great, but will the Department of Transport be able to cope with such entities under their fold?
Especially if you still think about that this is a transport department that's trying to get Prasa's house in order. That alone has been a huge headache for them.
Yeah, and it remains a huge challenge for the government to get it. Infrastructure, for example, that on a day-to-day basis, it's decimated. And it's like a losing battle because they are spending a lot of money in restoring those railway lines, and it's still the cheapest mode of transport for many workers who use train on a day-to-day basis going to work, and there hasn't been any reliable, especially that has got a huge network across the country like Prasa's trains. So we don't know how long will it take. There's been some progress, but many of the railway line are still not utilized, and there's, it will probably need a lot of money. And we'll see in the budget in terms of what are the plans and the progress that has been made on restoring the railway lines for Prasa.
And we're almost out of time, but Tshepo, there's been, of course, this huge talk of energy, and the president of the ANC even yesterday saying that this is a huge problem and they really do want to move with speed to resolve it. But while there's this anxiety about load shedding, there's now anxiety as well about NERSA and the decision that it is going to be making here when it comes to tariff increases. And it's an interesting balance between what Eskom needs and what South Africans actually need.
Yes, late last year we saw Eskom releasing its financial results after several delays. Of course, that helps NERSA, because NERSA must have a broader and clear picture about the financial situation at Eskom, and so that they can decide if that 1% is really justifiable. But also, NERSA has a responsibility to ensure that households are also interests are also taken into account, so that those rates can be affordable. But we know that even if you take out the proposed rate hike by Eskom, rates are very high for many households. They're battling, although some people think that otherwise. I mean, there's been talk that if you look at the way people use electricity, there's no sign that, it doesn't show that perhaps it's expensive, but it's a complex question because there are those who pay and those who doesn't pay. But for those who are paying, electricity is very, very expensive.
Definitely costly. Tshepo, let's then see what NERSA actually says here, because a lot of people are talking about it on social media, waiting for that particular decision. That is our economics editor, Tshepo Mongoai.